I don't think there is anything you can do to avoid dividing the class into two sets. They are so close to secondary, and if they are not a relatively strong reader, or at least have the beginnings of competency in reading, then so much of secondary history, geography, science, etc. is going to be inaccessible to them. So I think there is no shame in making that compromise and saying, actually, we are going to do everything in our power to support pupils to read. What it doesn't do is tell us much that's useful in formative terms. It doesn't really tell us what to teach or how to teach. The only thing it really can do is, by providing us with this very general idea of a pupil's attainment, it can tell us whether we need to explore a bit more deeply.
Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Christopher Such.
Hello again.
It's fantastic to see you again, Chris. It's been a while. You must have been busy working on something. What have you been up to that has prevented you from becoming our co-host?
Well, I mean, a lack of ability at podcasts is the main reason why I've not been involved as a co-host. But yeah, no, it's a great chance to plug something. I've been working on a series of professional development videos that take the reading lesson structures from my second book, Primary Reading Simplified, and talk teachers and school leaders through first, like, the rationale behind them, the theory behind them, but then also how to teach them, how to plan them in a way that doesn't take a huge amount of time. There's high quality footage of classroom teaching embedded into them. And if you want to find out more, you can contact me through my blog, primarycolour.home.blog. Thank you for the opportunity to plug that, Kieran. Hugely appreciate it.
No, I know I joke, but I know how much work you put into that, and how this is like properly done, wasn't it? So these are going to be really good videos, and bringing that book to life in particular, I think, is massive for the profession, because there's no reason why this knowledge needs to be the preserve of the few, I think.
And as a bonus, you get to see me, slightly waddling around the classroom in a slightly awkward fashion. So, always good. But yeah, I was lucky enough to work with Step Lab to film the videos. So the footage is of a really high quality, the sort of thing I never would have been able to have done without their help. So yeah, kudos to them, and thanks to them from me as well.
Oh, is it going to be such high definition that people are all, oh, is that what Chris looks like?
That's exactly it. Yeah, they're going to get the full real life experience. I updated my social media picture recently, mainly because I kept getting messages from people saying how weird and intimidating it looked, which wasn't intentional. That's just my face. But yeah, the update, if that hasn't already shocked people, then HD footage of my face with its wrinkles and moles and all that sort of thing is going to put people off. Hopefully, they'll still be able to focus on the professional development.
I mean, if you have the choice, never go full HD, because it's not smart. So we're almost like, we've been reflecting last week. Shannon and Tom were reflecting on mathematics and some of the questions from listeners. I've got some in reading, but actually there's one crossover, and I thought we'd start with it. And it's Tom's question about whether you had any advice for a teacher moving into mixed year 1-2 class, very wide range of attainment. Do you have any words of wisdom for teaching phonics? Now, we covered the mastering number element last week. But anything about phonics? We did try a bit, but obviously I'm the last person you want to ask about systematic phonics.
Cool. So yeah, I do have advice on this, not just on phonics. I'm going to expand it out a little bit, if I may, into the teaching of reading, like whole class reading that you might do in in upper key stage 1, fancy way of saying year 2. Because like a general principle, I think that I always advise schools to follow when they're teaching reading or anything else is teach as many pupils as you possibly can at the same time. And it's possible to interpret that in a simplistic way by suggesting that what you need to do is teach only whole class, never divide your class up. When what I would argue is that when we're talking about a year 1-2 class, just as I would say with a reception year 1 class as well, I don't think there is anything you can do to avoid dividing the class into 2 sets. The difference between the aspects of phonics that pupils will be learning, say at the start of year 1, or the parts of reading they'll be learning at the start of year 2, are so different that to try and teach all 30 or 35, however many kids you've got in your class at the same time, I just think would be a non-starter. I think this is one of those areas where we have to make the decision to divide the class up. Now, this isn't always the case when we've got 2 year groups in the same class. I think it's just about possible in Key Stage 2 to have a year 3-4 mix, or 4-5, or 5-6, and still teach whole class reading using sort of reading lesson structures I describe, or anything that achieves the same purpose. But I think when we're talking about reception and Key Stage 1, having 2 year groups in the same class, when it comes to phonics and other aspects of reading, I don't think it's possible to avoid dividing the class into 2. The one thing I'd possibly add to that is that might require a conversation with leadership in the school to say, well, actually, when I'm doing this division, there isn't necessarily something I can think of immediately that these kids can be working on independently, that when I'm working with the other group. So do we need to think about how adults are distributed across the school? Do I need to think about how we are putting different parts of the curriculum in place? Do I need to, for example, consider how instead of doing a 30-minute phonics lesson, I maybe break it up into shorter chunks so that a group of young children working independently isn't left in such a state for, a full 30 minutes phonics lesson. So you might need to adapt the timetable. But the short version is, I don't think there's a way to effectively teach phonics to a mixed year 1-2 group without some kind of dividing up of that class.
Yeah, I think normally I see it manifesting most schools will, from nursery through to year 2. They've got their phonics window, and then you go to as many adults as possible to work across the school. I mean, is that your experience, Chris? This is how you solve that issue, is that everybody's working to the same timetable bit?
That's often the case. I mean, that's especially the case with particular popular phonics programs. I think it's more common with stuff like Read Write Inc. than it is with, say, things like Sounds Right. I'm not sure about Little Wandle, I'd have to bear in mind, but those are some of the most popular phonics programs. I'm not sure about things like Essential Letters and Sounds, but it is the case that schools will do that. But obviously, in a school with a mixed 1-2 class, very often that's a small school, and so the extent to which they can, teach on that basis is limited. There are exceptions to that, of course. Sometimes you have schools that are, sort of 2.5 form entry almost, and that's why they've got a mixed 1-2. But more often than not, if you've got a mixed 1-2 class, it means it's a school with maybe 4 or 5 classrooms, and so dividing kids up on that basis is a bit more of a challenge.
Most maths assessment still happens in snapshots, whether it's at the end of a topic, a block, a term, or even at the end of a year. Now, those moments can be useful, but how confident are we that they are really giving us an accurate picture of learning over time? So ACEL Pro helps turn everyday curriculum-aligned maths practice into a richer evidence picture. Pupils work through carefully designed tasks, and as they do, teachers can see live how the class is getting on. They can spot mistakes, questions or topics that may need immediate follow-up, and they can decide what to revisit while the learning is still fresh. That evidence then builds into a class picture, telling teachers who may need support, who needs fresh evidence, and who may be ready for professional review. Teachers can also drill into individual pupil journeys with an up-to-date maths snapshot to support conversations with learners, parents, carers, or indeed colleagues. And because the evidence is structured right from the very start, it can roll up to school, trust, or local authority level, helping leaders spot patterns earlier and support the right conversations. Visit ACEL Pro, that is acel.pro, take the interactive tour and see how it could support maths, teaching, learning and assessment in your school.
When I saw the next one, Chris, I thought this is one for Chris. And actually, I should probably say early on, while people are still listening, that you always say to me you would happily do like whole episodes where you field as many questions as possible from people about the ins and outs of reading and spelling and whatever. So I think, you know, this, if you're listening thinking, oh, I've got questions, you're one of the people who actually said to me, yeah, I would happily do a whole big session on this. So yeah, so send them in. But the question says, I have a pupil in year 5 who is still an insecure decoder. How should we balance intensive reading intervention with protecting their access to science, history, the rest of the curriculum?
There are always compromises when we start to look at interventions. We're always, or almost always, depriving pupils of some aspect of the curriculum, and that is never ideal. What I would say is that, especially when we're talking about pupils in upper key stage 2, they are so close to secondary, and if they are not a relatively strong reader, or at least have the beginnings of competency in reading, then so much of secondary history, geography, science, etc. is going to be inaccessible to them. So I think there is no shame in making that compromise and saying, actually, we are going to do everything in our power to support pupils to read. Now, what might that look like? Because I'm not suggesting that it's possible or, well, practicable, I should say, or a good idea generally to say, well, we're going to teach kids for 3 hours a day to give them the best chance, just because we don't have the capability to do that in schools, even if we thought it were a good idea. But I do think that I don't think it's problematic to say, because of the importance of reading, that we are going to take, say, 30 minutes a day of a kid's time to support them with the basics. We talk about insecure decoding in this case, so we're presumably talking about phonics intervention still, though sometimes people might use that language to talk about issues with reading fluency. I don't think that taking 30 minutes a day is problematic. I think ideally you would want to take that from different bits of the curriculum. You wouldn't want it to be missing out on a whole year of history or a whole year of geography, say. So I think thinking carefully where you can about how you are changing the subject that child is being deprived of, and I'm afraid that is the word, they are being deprived of that element of the curriculum. But I don't think that, say, 30 minutes a day, 2.5 hours a week is too much. I think if you got to the point where you were trying to do more than that, then I think we could start to say that you probably were maybe compromising too much of that child's experience of the rest of the curriculum. But 30 minutes a day, maybe 45 minutes a day, I don't think that is a bad idea. In short, I think you just have to accept that there is a degree of compromise here. Try to say, if we can, we're going to give that child 30 minutes a day of support. And when we do that, can we make sure it's not always from the same subject? And just one final thing to note on that, we might, if possible, also consider, well, what it is that pupil particularly enjoys. You know, if they love PE, does that time have to be during the PE lesson? If they are really fired up by history, is there a way that we can make sure that intervention isn't happening during history? Wherever possible, and I know it always isn't, but wherever possible, taking into account the preferences and motivations of the child in question is a good idea.
Hello there. I just want to give a brief introduction to how my setting has used the story of maths. As a school, we wanted to upskill teachers' knowledge in how to teach mathematics and explore other pedagogical approaches, and that's where Kieran and Stuart came in. Their curriculum, the story of maths, it shows exactly what you need to teach in a really thoughtful way. They consider concrete, pictorial and abstract approaches. Interleaving and retrieval practice is throughout, which has really supported outcomes so far in our early moments of rolling out the story of maths in our setting. There's no request that's too large for them. They very prompt in their support for us and in rolling this out. I'd recommend the story of maths to anyone who's wishing to upskill their school in the teaching of maths and numeracy.
Next person says that they're repeatedly given a child's reading age as though it tells them what to teach next. And they wanted to know, what can a reading age genuinely tell us and what can it not?
So first thing to do, let's pin down exactly what a reading age is. Kids will do a standardized comprehension assessment usually, and from that you will get a score that you can then feed back into some set of data that will then tell you that, yeah, this is the score that would usually be achieved by a child who is 7 years and 3 months, or 9 years and 6 months, or whatever it might be. And what that can do is it can give a school, on the assumption they're not over-indexing any one result, any one bit of information, it can give a school a fairly clear idea of where that pupil is at roughly in their overall reading attainment relative to their peers, relative to age-related expectations. It's useful information potentially to feed back to parents, because it's, if you say your child is reading at roughly the standard we would expect of a 7-year-old and that child is 6, well, that's pretty clear information. Equally, if they're reading at that same standard but they are 9 years old, again, it gives pretty clear information. What it doesn't do, as the question pertains to, what it doesn't do is tell us much that's useful in formative terms. It doesn't really tell us what to teach or how to teach. The only thing it really can do is, by providing us with this very general idea of a pupil's attainment, it can tell us whether we need to explore a bit more deeply. So, for example, if a pupil is reading at, or is defined as having a reading age of 9 years old, but they are 7, we can probably fairly safely assume that we don't need to look further into whether there are issues with fluency or decoding, though I would still think it's a good idea to do a fluency assessment, to hear pupils read aloud periodically, so that you've got an eye on that anyway. But equally, at the other end of the spectrum, what it can do is, if you've got a pupil who is scoring significantly below where we'd expect them to do, it can tell us to look a little bit deeper. We could say, well, actually, let's look at their reading fluency. When I've heard them read aloud, what strategies are they using when they're trying to decode words? Are they using problematic partial decode then guess strategies, or are they just full stop guessing at words? Are they actually taking pretty sensible guesses at unfamiliar words, but by decoding through the entire word, which is fine, but are they maybe then not showing the level of word recognition automaticity that we might expect? Do we need to dive a little bit further, perhaps even, and look into their decoding? Are they struggling with blending? Are there gaps in code knowledge? But all of that stuff comes from those subsequent assessments, by looking into reading fluency, by looking into their code knowledge and blending, using something like a phonics screening check, or the sort of assessments that come along with your school's phonics program. In short, the actual reading age does not tell us what to teach or how to teach. It just gives us a rough idea of where pupils are at with their reading. It can be useful with several data points for individual pupils to get a sense of where they are. It might give you a sense of whether things are generally working with regards to cohorts of pupils, but what it can't really do is tell us, oh, we need to tackle this aspect or this reading difficulty, or we need to work more on building up reading experience, whatever it might be. And dare I say as well, even if we take those same assessments that produce reading ages and do question level analysis, like lots of schools sometimes do, that stuff isn't going to tell you what to teach either.
Right, I get you. Because when I read it, because I had to almost some of the questions I smooth out for the purpose of the podcast, but I felt, right, what is this being aimed at? It's the actual, right, okay, this is actually quite an astute observation, perhaps based on your work, where actually that level of precision is what's required, as opposed to the headline figure, right? Okay, I get you. Because I was wondering, where's this question going to? But that makes a whole lot of sense.
And I think connected to that, very often schools just get into, for reasons because they're busy and because they've got hosts of other priorities, they sometimes get into a situation where the breadth of their tackling, or their ability currently to tackle this kind of difficulties relating to reading, is they go, who's struggling with reading? And if they're struggling with reading, what is the thing that we are doing? And that's often where reading ages come in, because they can look at a reading age, they can say, oh, they're struggling relative to their peers, let's do the reading intervention. But ultimately, we need to go into a bit more detail than that. We do need to be seeing, well, is it code knowledge? If so, do we need to be progressing through the steps of our school's phonics program again? Or do we need to be doing that with all of the phonics program, or is it just code knowledge that, say, in the year 1 part of the phonics program? Is it not code knowledge at all, which is often the case? And is it just blending? Do we need to tackle that in particular? Do we need to do lots of modeling and practice of blending and segmenting to get kids there? Or is it none of those things and it's just reading fluency? Kids need scaffolded reading practice. But yeah, you can't learn that just from a reading age.
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly so much to it. I mean, if you were to do like webinars, this would go on past 5:45, wouldn't it? Maybe on to 6:10, you know, very easily. You know, you can really get into the weeds of this thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And dare I say, you can get into minute detail about what reading interventions you're going to do. You can get into, oh, actually, with this pupil, we're going to look at this little bit of code knowledge, and this pupil. You could make every intervention completely personalized on and have them delivered purely on a one-to-one basis, but that's never practicable, which is why I tend to divide things up into, is it code knowledge, is it blending, is it fluency, and, you know, determine your interventions on that basis.
The person says, our phonics program tells us that fidelity matters, but one child is making almost no progress. At what point should we adapt the program, and what should we do differently?
So before I tackle exactly what's meant by what is meant to be described by fidelity, it's worth making a more general point that I think is often overlooked in these debates, which is that some pupils, even with exceptionally good support and instruction, will find it much more difficult than others to learn to decode words initially, and then to become a fluent reader, and then over time to potentially also to comprehend text relatively easily. Some people just find that much more difficult, and there are a host of different reasons that might underpin that. So it can be possible that you can be doing everything right, and yet progress is relatively slow, especially with things like decoding, code knowledge, blending, etc. You can often put a lot of groundwork in and you not immediately see the fruits of that labor. It comes down the line. But with that in mind, so I'm coming back to this idea, let's talk about this idea of fidelity, because it has warped somewhat. When the phrase, or when the word fidelity is used to describe phonics, initially, and this is where it really has weight, it's used to describe the scope and sequence of the phonics program. So, you know, what relationships between graphemes and phonemes are you teaching, and in what order? And it's sensible to talk about fidelity in that sense, because you don't want to be requiring pupils to decode lots of words with code knowledge which is entirely unfamiliar to them at the early stages of reading, because they will fall into counterproductive word guessing habits. You know, you want to be giving them a chance to practice what they've learned in phonics, and so teaching in line with that scope and sequence is a sensible thing to do. It also allows you to use formative assessment, you know, to check along the way. What have kids understood of the things I'm supposed to have taught? What do I need to go back and cover again, etc. However, this word has started to be used sometimes to mean things like fidelity to the routines of a particular phonics program. What phrase or what words do you use when you're asking kids to spell a word or to decode a word? What step-by-step processes are you using when you're asking kids to do a bit of dictation or whatever it might be? And while I think there's real value in there being shared routines across a school when you're teaching phonics, and then most of the time translating those routines into our interventions so kids aren't, you know, caught off guard by our phonics teaching, it isn't that kind of fidelity that the government, for example, the DFE, are talking about when they're talking about phonics. So lots of phonics programs will say, don't you dare adapt or tweak anything. Don't try and make anything more efficient. And they have fairly good reasons for doing so, because they're worried about lethal mutations, etc. But what this shouldn't do is prevent us from looking at what it is that the kid's struggling with and targeting that. So fidelity to a phonics program might mean, oh, I do this part of the lesson and then this part of the lesson and then this part of the lesson, if we interpret it beyond this proper scope and sequence definition. And the case is that for pupils who are struggling with aspect of reading, it might not make sense for you to go through all of the routines of that phonics program. It might not make sense for you to go back through the entire scope and sequence of grapheme, phoneme correspondences, to go through all of that curriculum. Very often, for example, as I talked about in response to the last question, you will have kids who they know plenty of code knowledge. You can show them SH on a flashcard and they'll tell you that's sh. You show them AI and they'll say that's A, etc., etc. But what they struggle with is blending. And under those circumstances, you don't want to necessarily go through all of the steps of a phonics lesson or the phonics program more broadly. You want to target blending in particular. So in short, when we talk about like the fidelity and how it matters, ultimately we're meant to be talking about scope and sequence. Sometimes it's used to talk about the shared routines of a phonics program, and often these are beneficial to have the shared routines, but they shouldn't prevent us from saying, we've got a pupil here who's making no progress. Well, what is it that's holding them back? Is it even decoding at all? Is it that actually, have they passed a phonics screening check, but we are defining them as making no progress because they're not scoring well on comprehension assessments? Is that a result of a lack of fluency? Is that a result of a lack of broader reading experience, vocabulary, etc.? We can't be hemmed in when it comes to interventions by the exact routines that we might use in our lessons. Some of those micro routines to keep kids familiar with what's going on, perfectly fine, but find out exactly what it is kids are struggling with and target that.
Nice. So those two questions are linked then, really. There's so much under the surface here. Be really precise and forensic in your assessment. You know,
just on that before we move on, if schools are now thinking like, how do we do this? How do we decide which kids need support with blending, which kids maybe need support just with decoding polysyllabic words, which kids are basically fine with decoding completely, but we want to look at fluency, whatever it might be? Please feel free, again, reach out to me at primarycolour.home.blog. I've got a flow diagram that lots of schools have found quite useful, that allows you to, in a way that I think is pretty achievable for primary schools, allows you to say, okay, we can divide kids pretty roughly into these groups. Every kid is unique, of course, but in order for us to provide interventions in ways that are both individual enough to work, but broadly grouped enough to be practicable, we need something like this, I think. So yeah, please feel free to reach out to me and I'm happy to share it. Equally, it's a whole episode of plugs. You can find something like that in Primary Reading Simplified.
Nice. I will make sure to link, and maybe even I'll put in the image of your flow graph or whatever in the newsletter. So that's thinkingdeeply.info. And I think it probably makes sense if anyone has any questions for you in future, we can gather them up. Just anyone who signs up can respond to that email, and they can send the questions. That's basically what I do with this, is to collect them up. Yeah, so that is that's perfect. Oh, that's something I was going to say. Yeah, imagine my surprise when I saw that same logic being applied to mathematics curricula, and I thought, well, you know, if you have to do everything in that order, just stick on a video, and then, you know, you can be in charge of pressing play and pressing pause, and we could probably get a robot to do that, you know, if that's what teaching has become.
Well, yeah, there are people out there that seem intent on replacing us. Yeah, and quite a lot of them also seem to work in teacher education, which seems like an odd combination, but, you know, I won't go much further into that, I don't think.
Last one. I mean, last one's really interesting. I've got thoughts, but do audiobooks count as reading? Can they develop the language and knowledge needed for comprehension, or might they allow weak decoding to remain hidden, or perhaps all of the above?
Yeah, it's one of those questions where it is all of the above. Once every often on Twitter, there is a lively debate about whether audiobooks count as reading. And I'm always tempted to dive in and say, you're misunderstanding how language works. Like, they are reading a map is reading. Reading a book with no words in it, if we talk, it can be defined as reading, because that's how sometimes people use that word. What matters is, well, what's behind that? There are different ways ultimately that we use the word reading. No one thinks that map reading and reading a book or reading a mind or reading someone's emotions are necessarily related directly, or they're the same thing in any way. It's just the way that language works. Now, when it comes to reading with audiobooks, there is some overlap, because obviously what's usually being engaged with is entire texts, but in one case it is there presented in its visual form, whereas with an audiobook, of course, it's being read aloud. And when someone's reading a book aloud, there are certain things that we can take away. We are likely to be able to develop our vocabulary, to develop our understanding of the world. We might become more familiar with complex syntax that we might not see in everyday speech. You know, I might, and there are certain advantages that it might have even over written text. I might read the word, as a 12-year-old, I might read the word exaggerate over and over and think it's exaggerate because I've never heard it aloud, and I might just about work out the meaning, but it's only when I hear someone say it aloud or read it aloud that I make that connection, you know, that I recognize that, oh, that's the word that I hear other people using, etc. I might not automatically make that connection in text. So it's certainly the case that listening to an audiobook can be a valuable thing to do, and it can potentially develop certain aspects that will contribute to reading. It might, as I say, develop our vocabulary, background knowledge, understanding of syntax. It might subtly even contribute to our word recognition in the ways that I've just stated. Because if I come across that word, exaggerate, and I've heard someone say it in an audiobook, I'm more likely to be able to make that connection in text. I'm more likely to be able to correct my initial mispronunciation as I decode the word. But mostly what it's doing is potentially supporting with the that language comprehension side of things, as well, of course, as potentially building motivation and providing meaningful, enjoyable experiences with language, which is obviously really important for its own sake. But as the question suggests, it isn't really doing a great deal to develop a pupil's or word recognition. And I use the word pupil here advisedly, because if someone's already a relatively fluent reader, we might not need to worry quite so much about this stuff. If they're, you know, an adult, they've been reading books for 20 odd years, they might not have quite so much to gain in terms of their word recognition automaticity from putting in the hard yards of dealing with text in its visible form, or sorry, I should say visual form. But with kids, anyone or an adult learning to read, those hard yards are utterly necessary. They are unavoidable in the journey of becoming a really capable reader. And so if we want people to become capable, confident readers over the longer term, then we have to provide them with more practice than we can possibly get with audiobooks alone.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, in my experience, like I've been a member of Audible since like the very beginning, and it's a very transient experience, you know, because I mean, I'm pretty sure like when people try to research into whether it impacts on learning or long-term retention or what, you know, shown it doesn't really. And that would like some of the books I read at the start, I have no idea what happens in them. Some of the courses I've done like through audiobook form, I have no idea what the content was. So I can see how that matches up. But I think there's definitely value. It just might not be always the value you have in mind, I think, so to speak.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think also there's something to be said as an adult reader about actual texts, not just that extra difficulty potentially that you described, that extra effortfulness, that extra focus that's required to actually engage with text that might make it more memorable, but also just your ability to reread things. And I don't just mean, oh, I've got to the end of the chapter, I'm going to go back and check that. But I mean, in the moment, you know, you read a sentence or two and it just grabs you and you think, oh, I need to read that again. Just I want to appreciate the artistry of it. Or there's just something particularly beautiful or haunting or humorous about it that I want to read that again. Perhaps even want to commit it to memory. So yeah, audiobooks. I mean, I love an audiobook. I'm currently listening to Moby Dick at the moment, and it is a surprising barrel of laughs. It's actually really, really funny in a way that I wasn't expecting. But as you say, I do find myself occasionally going, oh no, I've just realized I've been thinking about something else for the last 30 seconds and I've just completely zoned out. And you can't really do that quite so easily with an actual visual text.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, only in certain, only in very specific circumstances will I use it for fiction reading. I'll only try and do non-fiction, and then I can make notes while I'm going along, if I'm trying to remember. But like someone at Shannon Neil's wedding recommended that I listen to Project Hail Mary because of obviously Rocky doesn't speak in a language that's comprehensible to humans, and so it was fantastic, But I immediately wanted to go back and watch the movie again, and perhaps even buy the book because I enjoyed it so much. But you only get that through the audio representation, I think. So I mean, it's been lovely chatting all things reading, and like I said, readers can comment, wherever they're listening. They can send emails in to ask questions. At the time of recording, England are still in the World Cup. By the time of release, I'll also say thank you very much for joining me. Thank you very much, Chris.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, Kieran.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.